to retrieve a fax, and his son Connor, apparently thinking it was a door, walked through it and fell to his death. Now, as you can imagine, Clapton was devastated. In fact, he said later, something in him died that day too. He said, I kept asking, what if I hadn't gone to get the fax? What if the housekeeper had not cleaned the window? For the next year, he said, it felt like he could not breathe, like there was a hole with walls so steep that he was in a hole with walls so steep that he would never escape. Now, maybe you have not experienced an Eric Clapton type tragedy, but I imagine every one of us have been suddenly thrust into the darkness at one time or another in our life. And I mean a darkness from which you never thought you would escape. A darkness that was accompanied by pain and hurt. A darkness that was so intense that you were quite certain it would never go away. Listen, how do you handle those times? How do you get up and go again after your life caves in? King David, the psalmist, has some answers for us here in this 23rd Psalm, because today we come to verse 4, which other than verse 1 is probably the most recognized of all verses in the Bible. Look at these words. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores and refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for His name's sake. And even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you, God, are always with me. So, how do we navigate when life leads us into one of those dark and frightening valleys? How do we make it when we are suddenly in a crisis that threatens to rip away our joy and peace of mind? Let me give you two things today, okay? Two things to remember from verse 4. The first one is this. Every sheep has their valley. Do you remember the Peanuts cartoon showing Snoopy on his doghouse typing a novel? And his opening line reads, "It was a dark and stormy night." And if you know Snoopy, you know that he always begins his novels that way, right? It's a dark and stormy night. Well, Lucy comes by and she starts in on him. She says, "You stupid dog, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. Who ever heard of such a silly beginning? Don't you know that all good stories begin once upon a time?" Well, she continues. She berates and belittles some more and then finally leaves, and Snoopy begins over on his story, taking Lucy's advice this time. So this time he writes, "Once upon a time, it was a dark and stormy night." That's good, right? But listen, isn't that the truth, really? Because eventually, for everyone, it will be a dark and stormy night. Incidentally, this valley of the shadow of death David wrote about, that's a real place. It's a geographical location. I've been there a number of times on our trips to Israel. It is a valley that lies between the hills of Bethlehem toward the Dead Sea. It's 1,500 feet deep with steep walls and shadows, and is very narrow. In fact, in some places it gets down to 15 or 20 feet wide. And it was a place where predator animals such as lions and leopards, as well as thieves and robbers, would prey upon the shepherds and their flock as they passed through there. It was really dark and an often dangerous place. And the shepherds in this area had to go there. It was their only route. They had to lead their sheep through this valley in order to get to the winter pasture areas at Jericho. Therefore, as a young teenager, David would have had the experience of leading his sheep through this very valley to safety, to provision on the other side. So he knew what he was talking about when he used that phrase. And when he uses this valley as a metaphor for fearful trials and troubles, we have to ask the question, what is he intending with that? And a couple of words here stand out to me. Obviously, that word death, the shadow of death. In fact, write that word down somewhere. He uses that particular word here, but the question, why would he do that? Because in the physical dimension, death is final. Death is really a dark valley. It's in the physical dimension, it is final. And it's something that everyone will experience and most everyone tries to avoid as long as possible. Am I right? And by the way, that goes for people of faith too. I mean, we all talk about how great heaven will be. Oh my, won't it be wonderful, that glorious day when we're in heaven? And yes, it will be wonderful. But if I told you right now that they were loading up the bus for heaven and they would be at your house next, I doubt that many of us would be standing out at the curb waiting to get on the bus. Am I right? You see, that's the bottom line of why we exercise, why we say our prayers, why we don't smoke, why we get plenty of rest, why we drink plenty of water and eat healthy. That's the bottom line. By the way, speaking of eating healthy, make sure to eat a small amount of meat each week. Because if not, you'll never be able to have a small dessert every so often. I've learned that lesson. If you don't eat your meat, you can't have your pudding. How can you have your pudding if you don't eat your meat? That's what Roger Waters told us. Remember him? Pink Floyd, Brick in the Wall. And now you know what I listened to last night. Anyway, obviously, I am digressing. And the reason I'm digressing is that even in a sermon, death is not a subject we like to hear about, or a subject that I as a pastor like to talk about. In fact, writing to the people of Corinth, the Apostle Paul said, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Now, the good news in that is, of course, that the destroyer of this thing called death is Jesus Christ, who, after being brutally murdered on a wooden cross, came back from the death as God resurrected him to new life. And the resulting good news from that event for us is that through Christ, we too shall be resurrected. We too shall come back from physical death. But until then, until that time, death, our enemy, looms dauntingly as a dark valley that we have to cross. Incidentally, did you ever see the movie Forrest Gump? I watched it not long ago. It's again, for I don't know the umpteenth time, I guess. But it's a great movie, is it not? And by the way, it's still immensely popular. And if you saw it, you remember it's the story of a challenged boy from rural Alabama, played by Tom Hanks, who as a child basically had everything going against him. No one ever thought he would succeed. No one ever thought he would make it in life, but he did. And became the quintessential American hero in the movie. Now, there were several poignant scenes. One in particular that I want to call attention to was when Forrest's mother was dying. And Forrest is fearful, he's scared, he's very, very emotional. So in an attempt to comfort her son, Sally Fields, who plays his mother in the movie, says this to him. She says, "Don't worry. Don't worry about death, Forrest. It's just a part of life." Now, fast forward to the end of the movie, basically to the end, and his wife, Forrest's wife, Jenny, lay dying herself. And Forrest is attempting to comfort her as his mom comforted him. So he says this to her, "Jenny," I catch myself talking like him, "Jenny, Mama used to say that death was just a part of life." And then he pauses dramatically and says, "I wish it wasn't." When I saw that for the first time, I remember saying right out loud, "Oh, I wish it wasn't either, Forrest." But it is. So, death is one of the dark valleys we face. And let's add another word there to death. Write down the word despair. As a matter of fact, this word that David uses here that we translate as death is not a word chosen by chance. This is an extremely significant Hebrew word that was meticulously placed by God in this psalm. It is a word that captures the entire gamut and array of disastrous possibilities we might face in life. It's a word that describes that moment when life for us is at its absolute worst. Not just the everyday troubles, but the darkest and most fearful times of all. That's this word. In fact, this verse can rightly be translated this way. Yea, though I walk through the glen of deep doom. Pretty ominous sounding right there, isn't it? Listen, all of us have experienced times of deep gloom, of deep sorrow, haven't we? Times of despair and pain. Times where we feel hopeless and wonder if we could even take another step. I bet you've been there at least a time or two in your life, right? I can tell you that as a pastor, I've been there, and I have had dear ones in churches that I've served over the years who've been there as well. I reflected back this past week as I was preparing this sermon for you, and I thought about a precious mom and dad some time ago who would just slip in and out of our services quietly and discreetly, trying to be unnoticed. And they would sit way back in a bleacher section of our worship center, dreading the thought of having to talk with anyone. So fearful of those questions like, how are you? Hey, how's it going? Why were they that fearful of questions like that? Because of their drug addict son at home dying from AIDS. That's called the glen of deep gloom, isn't it? Or a woman who wrote to me not long ago from Pennsylvania asking for prayer. And obviously she loves Jesus and attends church at a Saturday night service regularly. And while at that service, she said she always notices the couples, the husbands and wives in the church together. She notices that they read their Bibles in church there together, that they sing the songs together, that they pray together. And she says it breaks her heart. Why? Because her husband is home drinking, if he is home at all. And if he is not at home, he's usually with another woman. And she wonders if there's any hope or if there are any answers. Will God bring a miracle in my life, Pastor? And those are just two examples. As you know, there are thousands and thousands of other stories, especially in light of what's happening with COVID right now. And stories that are just as sad and seemingly just as hopeless. And that's enough. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what it means to walk in a dark valley. So, first of all, every sheep has their valley. And secondly, in every valley, there's the shepherd. Several years ago, while visiting in a home of some new members, I was having a conversation with the husband while we waited for the wife to finish with the baby's bath. All of a sudden, we heard this loud and scream, this panic-driven scream coming from the other end of the house. And so we both ran back to a utility closet where the couple's other small child had accidentally locked himself in. And he was locked. I mean, he was just beside himself in there, as you can imagine. Little guy. I can't remember. I think maybe 4 years old or so. And so Mom ran to get some tools while Dad tried to calm the child. I held the baby, by the way. She ran to get the tools while Dad tried to calm the child down. Don't worry, he said. Don't worry, honey. I'm right here. You're going to be fine. You're okay. And the little boy responded, but I can't get out, and I think there may be a boogeyman in here. Boo-hoo-hoo-hoo. You know, that kind of deal going on, boogeyman. Well, as his dad started working on taking the doorknob off, he kept on encouraging his child. Honey, listen to me now. You're going to be fine. There's no boogeyman in there. Mom and Dad are right here. And wouldn't you know, that little guy began to settle down, and he stopped crying. And he even began joking back and forth with his dad a little bit. Well, finally the door was opened and the boy jumped into his dad's arms and he said, Daddy, I just knew you would get me out of there. I just knew it. And then walking away from his dad, he turned around and said, but I'm pretty sure there is a boogeyman in there. Oh, don't you love that? Now listen, there are two takeaways from that story I just told you. Here's the first one. It is that most times what we fear is not reality, like that little boy's boogeyman. In fact, one of the latest studies out there found that 91% of our fears are never actualized. In other words, they never come to pass. Yet, Most of us still find ways to worry and even obsess over them anyway. Isn't that something? That's what David is speaking about when he uses this phrase, valley of the shadow of death. Because how many know the appearance of something evil can sometimes be just as frightening as the real thing? Isn't that the truth? Do any of you still have your Christmas lights up? We do. We have little twinkles all over our house. And it's really cool at night when all the lights are off and you just got little twinkles here and there, especially on one end of the house. Well, a few nights ago I was studying late and I walked from my office toward our kitchen. Now that entire end of the house is dark except for the twinkle lights. All right, get that in mind. And I've got headphones on, so I'm not hearing anything. I'm listening to music, I guess. So anyway, I get my drink and I get my snacks and I'm headed back toward my office and kind of listening to the music. You're thinking Pink Floyd, right? Nope, Bieber, Justin Bieber. Don't judge me. I'm just joking about Bieber, or maybe not. Anyway, I took a couple of steps from the kitchen toward my office, and I thought I saw something zip past me out of the corner of my eye. So I thought, well, that's crazy. That can't be. So I took a few more steps, and there it was again. Only this time, there were two somethings. So I stopped. I didn't think to take my headphones off, but I stopped and looked around, and nothing unusual. So I take another step, and this time, whatever it was came right at me. And when I tried to evade it by jumping away from it, I wound up tripping on one of the bar stools, and I fell on the floor with snacks and drink all over me and all over everything else. And to add insult to injury, my dog and cat were standing over me like, seriously, Dad? Really? Have you figured it out? Evidently, my dog had sneaked out of her pen and was chasing the cat on the other side of the room where the twinkle lights had cast this huge and very scary shadow of them coming right at me. And though I was sure I broke an arm or a leg when I tried to avoid that shadow by jumping over it, as I picked myself up, I realized, you know what? It wasn't the shadow that hurt me. It was me that hurt me. By the way, I'm just thankful my wife didn't come to that end of the house to laugh at me and get me on video for you guys. Wow. Here's the point. The point is I feared and I fell and I hurt my darn self over shadows. That which was not reality. Here's the second takeaway to this phrase. Most people are like me when I saw the shadow, in that when we are suddenly thrust into some kind of darkness, at least at first, we don't always feel the presence of God. Can you relate to that? I'm talking about feelings. If you can relate to that, I want you to know you're not alone. In fact, you are in good company, and I'm in good company with you, because King David was the very same way. Like right here in verse 4, he boldly proclaims, I refuse to be afraid, I refuse to fear, because I know, God, you are with me. Now that sounds confident, right? Yet if you'll just flip back through the rest of the Psalms, you will also find this same man saying things like, God, where are you? God, why have you forgotten me? Why have you forsaken me, God? The same guy. Now, isn't that something? So what's going on? Is David just fickle? Is he a flip-flopper? I mean, is God with him or is God not with him? Here's the deal. David is actually no different than we are, in that our feelings, rather than our faith, often rule the day. Does that make sense? However, it does not have to be that way, because the truth is that our shepherd makes his presence known to us even more obviously and more powerfully when we experience those tough valley walks. Remember how I told you shepherds were always out front leading their sheep last week, rather than behind them, driving them like you would in a cattle drive? Watch this. Verse 4 here tells us that at times the shepherd not only is out front leading, but other times he's also standing right beside the sheep, helping them through their valley or helping them through the hard and fearful part of their journey. And here's what that means for us as sheep in God's pasture. Here's what it means. When we walk through our own valley, our own dark shadow time, it means whether we know it or not, whether we believe it or not, and especially whether we feel it or not, God is with us. And I cannot think of anything more comforting than knowing no matter what, He is there. Look at someone and say, Jesus is there. And He is. There was a little boy one time standing on a downtown sidewalk in a busy city, and an older man saw him there by himself and walked up and asked him if everything was okay. And the boy responded that everything was fine. He was just waiting for a bus. And the man said, "Oh, son, there's no bus stops here. You have to go down the street a few blocks. This is not a bus stop area." Well, the boy turned to the man and said, "Oh, that's okay, mister. I know the bus will stop for me if I just stand here." The man thought he was being a little insolent, and so he repeated himself, "Son, the bus will not stop except at a designated bus stop, and this is not a designated bus stop. So the boy responded, "He was fine. Don't worry. He'll just wait right there where he was. He was fine." Well, this man turned around and left, and he was a little upset when he did. And as he was about to walk in a department store, he heard the screeching of brakes, and he turned quickly to see the bus stopping for the little boy. And the little boy turned to that man and waved at him and said, "Hey, mister, my daddy is the bus driver, and he's always looking out for me." Isn't that a great story? And a great reminder for us. A reminder that our shepherd God is always with us and that He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. So, when life gets tough, when you're really up under it, after you have doubted, after you have feared for a season, trust God, you will arrive at a place of peace. I promise you, you will come to that moment where you know that He is there, that He is with you, and that He is looking out for you. So, I end today with this question. Does your belief system support a God who is a personal shepherd? Does it support a God who loves you and cares for you in every season of your life? And if so, have you come to a place where you receive Him as that kind of God? If not, would you like to come to that place of knowing Him that way, in that personal way? If so, pray with me, will you? Pray this prayer. I'll pray it out loud, and you can pray it out loud or in your heart or however you want to do it there wherever you're watching this today. Pray this with me. Lord, I know You are the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd who cares and who protects and who forgives. The Good Shepherd who is always present. So Jesus, I receive that today. I receive that You are my shepherd. I receive that You are my shepherd, God. I receive You in all Your beauty and all Your fullness today. And every day, the rest of my life. Amen. Now, if you prayed that, let me hear from you this week. Send me a personal message on social media. Sign up for our email list if you will, and let me send emails to you. You can just send your email to me in a personal message, and I'll get it on our list and begin to send out devotions to you during the week. But especially if you prayed with me today, if you're trusting Christ to be your shepherd, God, please let me know about that, will you? And listen, this week, you remember that God is with you every step of the way. Whether it's your season to go through the valley or it's your season to be on the mountaintop, whatever, God is there, Jesus is there, and He will never leave you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's message. We will continue this series next week. Until then, God bless you and keep you. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.